Hi everyone, welcome to Flourish FM, a podcast for the good life. Our guest today is Dr. Joanna Moncrieff. Dr. Joanna Moncrieff is a professor of critical and social psychiatry at University College London and a consultant psychiatrist for the NHS in London. She studies the effects, action, use, and representation of psychiatric drugs, including antidepressants and antipsychotics, and has also written about the history and philosophy of psychiatry. She has published several books, the most recent of which is Chemically Imbalanced, The Making and Unmaking of the Serotonin Myth, which was published just a few months ago in 2025. Her other books include The Myth of the Chemical Cure, Bitterest Pills, and A Straight-Talking Introduction to Psychiatric Drugs. She's written for The Guardian, Daily Mail, Conversation, Literary Review, was profiled in The Spectator, and has been interviewed for several major podcasts. Nick, what did you enjoy most about our conversation with Joanna?
I think ultimately it was a conversation about our framing of and relationship with unpleasantness. And she tackles it from what I think could sound to our listeners like a very complicated, and it is in some ways. It's highly rigorous, it's highly scientific, right? And we're talking about neurochemicals, but she distills it in a way that I think, at least in theory, makes really good sense, is extremely practical, and most importantly to our purposes, is relevant to flourishing. Right? Because if we understand it and think about it, maybe try to tackle it in the way that she's suggesting, it opens up, I think, possibilities beyond just pharmaceuticals, right? Or what we talk about in part of the episode, which is SSRIs and antidepressants more specifically. So I thought it was an interesting lens. I certainly learned a lot, and I think there's going to be some practical takeaways for our community.
Absolutely. I learned a lot too. We hope you enjoy it as well. This is the ways we respond to our environment and how they impact flourishing with Dr. Joanna Moncrieff. Dr. Joanna Moncrieff, welcome. How are you?
Very well. Nice to be here, John.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to interview you. And ahead of this, we've loved reading your book, Chemically Imbalanced, The Making and Unmaking of the Serotonin Myth, which was recently published. So looking forward to discussing that today. Now, you're a psychiatrist whose work specializes in the effects, action, use, and representation of psychiatric drugs. And you're also a leading figure in something called critical psychiatry, which is a controversial movement that rejects mainstream psychiatrists' medical approach to mental illness and is skeptical of the view that mental disorders are simply brain diseases. Could you please describe the focus of your research and what exactly critical psychiatry is?
Yes, so I've always had an interest in looking at psychiatry in a different way. The idea that psychiatric problems like, emotional problems like depression and anxiety, and even more complex problems like schizophrenia, for example, the idea that they are simply the product of abnormal brain events has never seemed convincing to me. It's never seemed like a very useful way of understanding them. And lots of other people have raised those questions before, have also queried whether this is the best way to approach mental health problems and propose that we see them differently. So critical psychiatry, I suppose, is that collection of people who've raised questions about this medical approach to psychiatry. People who might be classified as critical psychiatrists have often also questioned the dominance of the pharmaceutical industry within psychiatry, have questioned the use of the medical model to enforce social control and social conformity, and grappled with issues of that sort. So that's critical psychiatry. And I've also had a long-standing interest in the use of drugs for mental health problems. And my overall position, I think, can be summarized as this. I think that some drugs can be useful in some situations, but we fundamentally misunderstand what we do. And the fundamental misunderstanding is this idea that they work by targeting an underlying chemical imbalance or symptom generating mechanism. And so a lot of my academic work has been looking at psychiatric drugs through this critical lens and trying to understand what it feels like to take them, and how the changes that they produce, changes which they're going to produce in anyone, whether or not they have mental health problems, how those changes interact with people's underlying feelings and emotions and symptoms of distress.
Are you familiar with Todd Rose and his book, The End of Average, by chance?
I haven't read it, no.
Yeah, it's been referenced to you before. Yeah. So the reason I bring it up is he makes an argument, essentially like against the use of averages or the idea of means. And one of the ways he makes that argument is reviewing, and I'm going to forget some of the details, but the story of early fMRIs or brain scans and how they were sort of compiled together to create what this group of researchers were referring to as a quote unquote normal brain. Lo and behold, you can't find a scan that looks like that brain, right? So this conglomeration of averages didn't really reflect this quote unquote normal. It kind of back it into the question, but you said abnormal. Is there such thing as a quote unquote normal brain? Because it sounds like a lot of us think there's this standard, right? And this where we're going, the serotonin kind of relationship is based off this standard. But I think I kind of hear you saying there really isn't a standard necessarily.
So obviously we're all different, and there are, infinite diversity of human personalities on the planet, and a corresponding diversity of human brains. Now, there are times when things in the brain go wrong. That's definitely the case. We have people get brain diseases like epilepsy and brain tumors and multiple sclerosis and things like that. And those processes affect people's, behavior and emotions and things like that. So I would say that's a situation where you've got an abnormality in the brain that, has an impact on someone's behavior and feelings. But the vast majority of situations that we refer to as mental health problems, there is no such underlying, clearly pathological process going on. But as you say, there is a huge diversity of brain activity that corresponds to the diversity of people we have in the world.
Right. Yeah. Great little distinction and nuance there. Thank you.
Yeah, and this nicely leads into your understanding your definition of depression and how it's different to some other definitions. So in a recent publication you co-authored, which we enjoyed reading, Difficult Lives Explain Depression Better Than Broken Brains. You and your co-authors argue that our feelings and behavior are not best understood as simply the property of our brains, but as the properties of us as whole human beings immersed in our social world. And you give the example of like the association between activation of certain areas of the brain and liking the Beatles. That could be studied, but this preference is more likely understood by examining the relationships and experiences associated with this music in the person's life. And the same applies to feelings like despair and hopelessness. So could you please elaborate on that analogy and to explain what your view on depression is?
Yeah. So I think it's important to think about the meaning of emotions when we think of something of a state like depression or anxiety. And emotions are, by definition, they are reactions to things that are happening in our lives. Now, those reactions are colored by our previous experiences. So, if we've had a really terrible childhood, we may be sort of more reactive to events that are going on around us than someone who hasn't, for example. But the point is that an emotion is a reaction, and it doesn't make sense really to have an emotion without it being related to something that is happening to the individual. And that means that you can't understand an emotion simply as a brain process. You have to understand what that individual is reacting to and what the reaction means. Why is this situation making this person upset? Why am I crying? It might be because I've lost, my dog's just been run over, for example. Now, to understand the nature of my feelings, you need to understand my feelings about my dog. Why you need to understand how human beings in general react negatively to loss and to change. And so all those things feed into what we understand as an emotional state. And they are, as you pointed out, properties of people, not of brains. They relate to what we care about, what we value, what we like and what we don't like, what we hope for, what we aim for, etc.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you describe it as a mood state, right? A way that we, as complex, intelligent beings, react to events in the environment.
Yes, exactly. So a mood state can be seen as a sort of prolonged emotional state.
Mm-hmm.
An emotion might, emotions in general include things that are also quite short-lived, like anger. But a mood state is by definition something that lasts for a bit longer, but is still, like an emotion, a reaction to one's circumstances, coloured by everything that's happened to the person in the past and the sort of person that they are and what they hope for in the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I take it you wouldn't describe it in terms of like being a rational state or not, then, because it's emotional rather than a state that you reason yourself into. Although you could perhaps reasoning your way out of it could be part of it, but it's not so much that reason's playing a role here. In rationality, it's more just an emotional reaction to the world.
So I think our emotions are bound up with rationality, but we may, in the throes of an extreme emotional state, become irrational. But normally, there is some rationality behind our feelings. We don't like situations where we're losing things, or where we're humiliated, or where we are hurt, emotionally hurt or physically hurt. So that's completely understandable and rational. So I think, yes, although when we're in the throes of a strong emotion, we can lose our grip on rationality, I don't think they're completely disconnected phenomena. So we have this idea at the moment that we can look in the brain to understand various human characteristics, like our feelings or our intelligence. And I think that's the wrong way of looking at human beings. I think instead of seeing us as sort of mechanical systems that have brains, and you need to understand the brain to understand what we do, you need to see us as whole human beings who have these sophisticated capacities because we have large brains. Mm-hmm. So it's not that the brain is irrelevant. Of course it is relevant. It's what makes us the intelligent creatures that we are. And it's what gives us the ability to react to our environment in a very sensitive way that enables us to be flexible and adaptable and therefore, successful creatures. But it means that you have to understand human capacities and human feelings at the level of the person, not by looking inside the brain.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for making that very clear. So let's now channel that into your recently published book, Chemically Imbalanced: The Making and Unmaking of the Serotonin Myth, which was published in the US last month, September 2025. And in that you argue that the theory that depression is caused by a serotonin imbalance and that antidepressants can alleviate depression by targeting this mechanism is a scientific myth. Now you describe the history of the serotonin theory of depression from its development in the 1960s through to recent revelations that it's not supported by evidence. Can you please describe what exactly serotonin is and what the serotonin theory of depression is?
I can, but before I get to that, maybe I should just start by saying one of the reasons I wrote the book is because we have this idea that depression is caused by some sort of biological mechanism is so deeply ingrained in us now that when myself and some colleagues published this paper showing that there was actually no convincing evidence for there being a serotonin abnormality in people with depression, the reaction of the media and many members of the public was such shock. And they felt that, okay, if it's not serotonin, well, it must be some other sort of biological mechanism. So what other part of the brain is going wrong then if it's not the serotonin system? I was asked that a lot. And one of the reasons for writing the book was to was to emphasize that this is not the only possible way of understanding depression, and that in fact, people have understood it completely differently in the way that we were talking about earlier as an emotional reaction to circumstances for millennia before we were coached into this new way of thinking, of seeing it as this brain reaction. So the idea that depression is caused by an abnormality in the serotonin system was first raised in the 1960s and formulated into what came to be known as the serotonin theory of depression. In fact, most interest in the 1960s was in another chemical called noradrenaline, and so the main chemical theory at that time was the idea that depression was caused by a lack of noradrenaline. Then there was a research project set up in the 1970s to see whether there were any abnormalities in noradrenaline or serotonin in people with depression. No results from those studies were ever published, or no clear-cut results, so I can only assume that they didn't find anything. And by the 1980s, it really looked as if this idea that depression was caused by a chemical abnormality in the brain was going nowhere. But it was picked up by the pharmaceutical industry in the late 1980s in order to market their new range of big blockbuster drugs for psychological problems or emotional problems, which were the SSRI antidepressants. And it was really important for them to accompany their marketing of these drugs with this story that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance in order to distinguish these new drugs from benzodiazepines, which were the old range of blockbuster drugs, which had been very widely prescribed, widely used, but by the late 1980s had acquired a very bad reputation because it had become apparent that they very often caused people to become physically dependent and have really real difficulties getting off them. So they'd got a bad reputation, and the pharmaceutical industry wanted to make sure that people didn't associate the SSRIs with benzodiazepines. So first of all, they decided to aim them, position them for the treatment of depression rather than anxiety, which was the target of benzodiazepines. And secondly, they emphasized that what these drugs were doing was, they said, targeting an underlying chemical imbalance. And that was because the benzodiazepines, whose effects are rather similar to alcohol, are clearly having an effect by numbing people out, by changing people's awareness and level of consciousness, making people emotionally numb and sedated as well. And so this idea that the antidepressants were targeting an underlying chemical imbalance helped to distance them from that idea that drugs that are prescribed for mental health problems work by numbing people.
How are you using biological here? Because my question in my head is, if mood states, right, aren't a biological shift, what are they? And maybe we're segmenting like biological versus psychological here, right? To me, it's we're all, what I hear from kind of often in the coaching world is biopsychosocial. It all matters. It's all a system, right? And maybe I'm just too direct kind of with the question here, but if not biological, what do we think is happening? Maybe you're going to tell me there's nothing wrong happening. That's actually an accurate reaction to traumatic or terrible events, right? But
yeah, so good point. So obviously there are biological things. There are things happening in the body and the brain when someone feels depressed. We don't know, though, that what happens in my brain when I feel down is the same as what happens in your brain when you feel down, and we don't know, that people who are diagnosed with depression are having, some sort of similar brain activity going on,
imbalance or whatever.
Yeah, exactly, whatever it is. But yes, of course, that there are biological things going on. And well, we can't say whether those things are normal or not, because we can't identify what they are. We can't identify any brain processes or states that are specific to feelings of depression or anxiety or any other mental health problem that you could care to name. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we hear a lot about the biopsychosocial, which is fine, and of course, it's important, I think, if for general well-being, to have a well-functioning body, that all our biological systems are working well. Of course, that's important. If you're sick or depleted in some way, that's going to make feeling happy and being productive more difficult. But in general, when we're thinking about emotional states, we're not thinking about underlying sort of specific pathological mechanisms when they exist. And sorry, so yes, this is what I'm going to say. So the problem with the biopsychosocial model, I feel, is that it sort of gives the impression that there might be some specific biological mechanisms that are relevant. And as soon as we find or identify them, we probably have a full-blown disease like multiple sclerosis or something like that. And or say something a bit less dramatic, like thyroid hormone problems, thyroid disease. Now, if someone has a condition like that, then that does trump other considerations. If someone comes into my office and is feeling really down and lethargic, and it turns out they have hypothyroidism, you treat the hypothyroidism. And if they're still depressed, then you might start inquiring about, what else is going on in their life. But the first thing is you treat the medical condition, and you would expect the person to then feel better. So my worry about this biopsychosocial idea is that it gives the impression that there are specific biological mechanisms, and then that really aligns with this idea that there might be an underlying disease. And actually, if there's an underlying disease, that does usually trump other considerations, and then social and psychological considerations get relegated and forgotten about. And maybe it's easier. I feel like I'm waffling a bit. Maybe it's easier to express it like this. When I see people in my office who think that that their depression is caused by a chemical imbalance, it is often very difficult to convince them that actually it's important to look at other aspects of their lives. Because if they do have a chemical imbalance and we have a drug that can put that right, why should they? Why should they start, questioning whether their relationship is really as ideal as they think it is, or whether they really like their job, or do they feel satisfied in life in general? They've got a chemical problem. They need the chemical problem treated. So I do worry that this biopsychosocial thing, actually, because the bio is still there, encourages people to fix on that, and sometimes therefore to forget the importance of other things.
Hi, everyone. This is just a quick break to thank one of our sponsors, the Shipley School. We're extremely grateful to be supported by our friends at the Shipley School, an institution that has served as a trailblazer of well-being education for decades. Educating to Flourish is an approach to educational practice that promotes a focus on actualizing human potential. While this means continuing to prioritize the development of traditionally academic competencies, it also recognizes that these competencies are a small part of what leads human beings to live good, impactful lives. Using data-driven methods backed by various scientific fields such as neuroscience, educational psychology, behavioral economics, positive psychology, and more, the goal of Shipley's approach is to cultivate flourishing, the synergistic combination of well-being and optimal performance. Shipley aims to do so for all constituencies that make up the entire Shipley community. For more information about the Shipley School and education for flourishing, visit shipleyschool.org or contact Dr. Sharon Russell, Director of Student Support and Wellbeing. Thank you.
Hi friends, Nick here with just a brief interlude to share with you an update on one of our newest partnerships with the Anti-Fragile Academy. Throughout John and I's conversations with many, if not most, of our guests, one thing has been made really clear. In order for people to flourish, thrive, experience the good life, they need to develop the capacity to not only navigate and endure, but ideally grow from the bad, grow from unpleasant experiences. That's why we're thrilled to be partnering with our newest sponsor, the Anti-Fragile Academy, an organization that I co-founded with Dr. Adam Wright, Director of Mental Performance for the Washington Nationals. At the Anti-Fragile Academy, we work with adolescent athletes, executives, and educators to help them understand some of the science, not just of optimal performance, but of well-being and anti-fragility. The ability not only to endure and bounce back from unpleasantness, but to actually come back stronger, to grow from it. Between Adam and I, we've worked with Fortune 100 companies, Inc. 300 executives, Division I programs, and elite professional athletes and Olympians from all over the world. To find out more about how you can leverage anti-fragility training, check out our website at theantifragileacademy.com. Yeah, definitely not the way I think of it. Everything you just described to me is biopsychosocial. Like, why wouldn't we ask about, REBT or CBT? Why wouldn't we dig into relationships? And I think we'll talk about meaning and sort of these core inside out things. But I can appreciate, especially given your argument and the lens you're taking, why you'd be particularly, not to put words in your mouth, but concerned about overemphasis on the biological part, right? But I think I hear the same thing. It's all one system, right? And we've got to look at the different aspects of that system, not just the serotonin levels, for a simple example.
I suppose I'm making a distinction between our general biological well-being and having a specific medical disease or condition that might respond to treatment or might not. Obviously, we all need to attend to our, biological health, and it's good for our well-being to be fit and healthy.
Well, maybe here's our transition into flourishing as well. I'm not sure if you've dug into Corey Key's work at all. He basically makes the argument that you could have a quote unquote mental illness and be flourishing. Right. And the reason I bring this up is and again, I don't want to put words in your mouth. It sounds like maybe there's a normalization of a depressive mood state. Like, and again, people could not want it. They could not want to feel that. And we could probably have that be the case and not call it a disease. Is that what I'm hearing a little bit, right? Like, those things can coexist. You could be suffering through depression greatly. It doesn't necessarily mean something biologically is wrong on a disease-like level.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also doesn't necessarily mean that something is wrong at a psychological level either, because like you say, actually depression can, and I would say usually is, a completely understandable and rational reaction to what an individual is experiencing. Obviously, there's a big spectrum, and some people, and we all react differently, and some people, react much more strongly to things that other people wouldn't react so strongly to. But in general, it is a rational and meaningful response to, stressful environmental circumstances. And therefore, it is something that we can learn from. That's what our emotions are there to do. They are there to tell us what is a comfortable situation and what's a not comfortable situation, and to nudge us into changing our circumstances if we can. If we're feeling miserable, the normal response is to work out how why and what you might be able to do about the causes of why, the reasons for why you're feeling miserable. Mm-hmm. What can you change in your life if you're feeling miserable because your job is so horrible? How can you change that? So emotions, have an important function.
Yeah. And what you've just said there about it being sometimes a rational response to your environment situation, that's why I asked earlier about to what degree this is a rational response. And what you just said there about it being something we can learn from is a nice segue into the connection to the theme of this podcast, flourishing, because there's growing research in the role of suffering in flourishing. So, for example, that experiencing and recovering from difficult life experiences, such as trauma, can help a person build their character by, for example, becoming more resilient or anti-fragile, and gain perspectives, what they value most, experience, some degree of character growth. So from your career, what's your view on the role of suffering, for example, as a result of depression, such as experiencing and recovering from it in living a flourishing life?
Yeah, I think this is a really important issue. And it's one of the reasons why I am so concerned about the mass prescribing of antidepressants. Antidepressants are drugs that dial down emotional sensitivity and numb people. Whether that's helpful or not to people is a whole other question, but they definitely do that in people who are depressed, but also in volunteers. To greater or lesser degrees. They're very different agents from lots of different chemical classes, but most of them have that property. And I'm very concerned that if we numb people to their emotions, people then don't learn that actually distress and sadness, first of all, generally naturally get better with time, particularly say if the sadness is because of a loss, if it's a form of grief, which may not just be a reaction to someone dying, it may be a reaction to losing a relationship breakup or moving house even. So there is some negative emotional states will just naturally get better over time, and some get better because people change the things that are making them feel sad or angry or anxious. And if we just numb people's emotions, then people don't learn that actually there are things that they can do to make themselves feel better. And I feel particularly concerned that many young people are now going onto antidepressants and remaining on them for years during their, teenage and young adult lives at a time when people are experiencing, having lots of intense experiences and really developing their personality. And these drugs are, dampening that experience down, dampening down the normal emotional reactions that we would have to the sort of experiences that people are having. And therefore potentially, interfering with the learning process that people go through, which, as you say, can strengthen people, can give people confidence and resource to address adversity, to get through adversity in the future. So, I think if people don't go through adversity, then they will, because their emotions are all damped down, or don't go through the normal reactions to adversity because their emotions are damped down, they will remain vulnerable and fragile and not develop the sort of strength that people would normally develop through going through those experiences. Having said all that, I don't want to overly romanticize suffering and adversity. And obviously there are some people who, really have a very strong reaction to circumstances that the rest of us wouldn't find too difficult. And that can be difficult. I would say, though, that even in those situations, there's really no good evidence that giving people emotion-numbing, mind-numbing drugs is of much benefit or any benefit. And what people need in those situations, I think, is, care and support and help from people around them to help them endure their situation and work out what can be done about it.
A lot of this is resonating. Just a couple days ago, I should say, I finished The Comfort Crisis by Michael Easter, which, if you haven't heard of it, is a good read. But it basically goes through a lot of the biology and psychology research on what you just said, sort of these toughening effects or anti-fragility effects. For everything from kind of cold to enduring unpleasantness and in a variety of ways. Earlier, you kind of described emotions as data, which I think John and we use similar language. I think it's a really useful thing. What I kind of hear you saying is these SSRIs essentially filter out a lot of the data or dampen a lot of the data. So if you're getting less data, to me, then you're learning fewer lessons.
Yeah,
right. And we just had Shigeo Ishii on talk about psychological richness, right? Sort of these perspective changing experiences. And we talked about the affective nature of things like that. And just kind of linking episodes here, it occurred to me, if you're dulling that positively and negatively, you're really robbing yourself of the enrichment that can occur. Right. Now, maybe I'm misunderstanding all that, but does that feel like mostly an accurate synopsis?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I'm saying. I like the term, I can't remember who coined it, I'm afraid, that emotions, or it might have been in relation to depression or anxiety, is a signal for change. I think that's the idea of emotions as a signal is a really useful one.
Yeah. And you're just getting a weaker signal. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Here's the question I do have, though, because and maybe this is just outliers, right? And I don't practice any of this, so I'm going to go off of sort of generalized understanding here. When working with somebody with severe depression, are there not instances where there's just such a lack of agency that it's hard to even get the first action, the first behavior change started? In those cases, is there any helpfulness to try to take on, let's call it, chemicals or biology? Like you mentioned, maybe thyroid as a starting point, not to equate those as the same thing. But what do you do with somebody who psychologically...
People with severe depression can get into a sort of vicious circle where they have such a sort of negative perception of the world that they withdraw, and therefore they get less opportunity for having any positive feedback. So that sort of, cements them into this very negative state. And they may even start to, have irrational ideas, delusions. Often people who are really depressed think they've lost their bodily organs or something like that. So that can certainly happen. The trouble is we have, well, first of all, there's still no evidence of any specific biological mechanism associated with that sort of very severe picture of depression. And there is no good evidence that drugs like antidepressants are actually helpful in people in that very severe state either.
Kickstarted.
I mean, antidepressants, they're not stimulants. And actually, maybe in theory, if you gave someone in that state some stimulants, it might sort of give them a bit of energy and perk them up a bit. And in fact, people tried that in the 1960s. But there's not really evidence that it worked, probably partly because people quickly become tolerant to the effects of stimulants. And also because maybe, if you are in that deeply depressed state and you're being sort of artificially stimulated, maybe you're just not ready for it. So there are, people can get into very extreme states of depression, sometimes with psychotic symptoms, still no evidence that is caused by some specific biological mechanism, and no good evidence that tweaking the brain helps. I should just add, because a lot of people might do say that ECT is useful in these situations.
I'm not familiar with ECT. Thank you. Gotcha. Okay. Got it.
So ECT, electroshock therapy. basically putting electricity through the brain.
Sure.
Now, ECT can sometimes temporarily shock people out of this sort of state, because it produces a sort of artificial state of in which you lose your memory, and sometimes people get a sort of artificial state of euphoria, a bit like when someone's had a brain injury. So temporarily, people can come out of this state after ECT, but they then generally sink back into it, or sink back to where they would have been a few weeks down the line in any case, because usually people are gradually coming out of this state by the time they are given ECT.
And if I understood some of the conversation earlier correctly, say there's an SSRI, because in my head you're saying, okay, well, if you can help somebody experience less pessimism, less hopelessness, would that do much? But what I'm hearing is, it wouldn't just damper pessimism or hopelessness. It might also damper inspiration or drive or excitement. So you're not really changing the ratio, so to speak.
No, absolutely. And I think that's what's important, because although in theory, you can see that a drug that dampens emotions might be useful in someone who's really sad or really anxious.
Yeah.
The research actually doesn't show that antidepressants are really any significantly better than a placebo. They're statistically tiny bit better, but clinically, but it's doubtful that the difference is clinically significant. And I think that is because, as you say, what they are doing is not just dampening negative emotions, but dampening positive experiences, positive feelings like excitement, inspiration, joy, love, etc. And for that reason, also, many people don't like that emotional blunting effect.
So, and feel free to abstain or skip, but I'm super curious if you have thoughts or opinions on, call it plant medicine, psilocybin, those sorts of things as potential. Maybe you don't even like the word treatment for depression, right? But a way of trying to alleviate some of that unpleasant affect.
Yeah. So I think the case of psychedelics is really interesting. And I have quite a lot to say about it. So it started off with the idea of what was called psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And the idea was that someone would go and take 1 or 2 doses of a psychedelic drug, and then have some therapy to help them process those experiences, to basically process the trip that they had had. And the idea was that for some people, this would act as a learning experience, would enable personal development. And I think that is a reasonable model. I think it's been oversold somewhat. Sorry,
no problem. No worries. It's official that way, right? Busy office.
Yeah. I think it's been oversold, and I think there are other ways that people can gain insights that might be helpful with depression or anxiety or any other state, such as listening to beautiful music, walking in nature, climbing a mountain, doing some sport, whatever it is. But that's not to deny that it is also possible. For some people, I think, do get some interesting insights into life through taking mind-changing drugs. Not necessarily just psychedelics. I think people can learn things from other sorts of drugs too, but psychedelics, with our sort of, this very unusual experience you have, maybe one of the most typical things that are associated with this idea of personal development. The problem is, that's not a very profitable model, just offering 1 or 2 sessions and then having to pay a therapist as well for lots of therapy is not something that's going to make anyone much money. So there is a tendency for this model to change into something that looks much more like taking an antidepressant every day, into people, for example, with ketamine. We know this has happened with ketamine. Exactly. People coming back once or twice a week, or, a few times a month, to get top-up doses, partly because they haven't reached nirvana. They haven't worked out how to resolve their problems, but they keep trying to see whether they can. So, in that respect, I think it's potentially dangerous. We're now rolling out a long-term treatment whose long-term effects we have not properly tested. We don't know what the consequences of taking LSD or ketamine. Well, we know that there are all sorts of nasty consequences from taking ketamine repeatedly on a long-term basis, because we know that from the recreational drug scene. I think we know less about continuous LSD use. So that's one of my concerns. And along with that, there are starting to be ideas around that, that what these psychedelics are doing are, they're reversing some serotonin abnormality. We're getting exactly the same sort of simplistic models, mechanistic models that we get in relation to antidepressants. This idea that psychedelics are targeting the underlying mechanisms of depression or anxiety or wherever it is. There's no evidence for that. Or no compelling evidence for that, and it just enables this long-term repeated use of treatments and people to cash in and profit from that sort of that way of doing things.
Thank
you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Joanne. Now we know we've only got a couple of minutes left, so we usually finish this podcast with our episodes with a question we call the flourishing question, which is to ask our guests for one lesson on flourishing they'd like our listeners to walk away with in a practical step, putting it into action. And if we could perhaps target that in relation to your research, we talked here about throughout this, depression being much more complex than it's often theorized to be, and you've talked about it being kind of a rational emotional response to the world. So what would be kind of one practical lesson you'd recommend our listeners take to avoid the risk of becoming depressed, or perhaps to help alleviate depression if they are experiencing it?
I think one of the biggest causes of depression nowadays, well, there are many causes, there are as many causes as there are people who are depressed. And that's the problem with giving you one answer, because
okay, well, feel free to make it more complex, of course.
Yes.
You don't want to oversimplify this at all. So yeah.
No, it's fine. It's fine. If to getting over depression or getting through depression, it depends on what's making you depressed as to how that needs to be done. So it's all about tackling the reasons for how you feel, addressing them, making the changes in your life that are going to make you feel better. So I suppose general lessons, one would be, this idea of emotions as a signal for change. What is it that might need changing that is making you feel down or anxious or stressed? And then I would say that, linked to that, I think one of the main reasons that people feel sad in particular is that they lack purpose in life. I think this is a sort of general thing that our that our generations, all the generations since the sort of early 20th century have been grappling with, that as we have become a more secular society, and we can't just think that we're here because God put us here, we have to find our own reasons for living, and our own purposes and our own goals. So I think finding a purpose in life is a really important thing for people to protect them against, feelings of sadness and despair and lack of purpose and low self-esteem. We're all going to, find purpose in different things in different ways, aren't we? Mm-hmm. Whether it's, I don't know, whether it's doing something to help other people or setting ourselves sort of targets and goals and, quests or tasks to do. But finding purpose, I think understanding emotions as a signal for change and finding purpose in life would be my two sort of nuggets for what they're worth.
Great. Well, that's a perfect answer related to human flourishing. Thank you so much, Dr. Joanna Moncrieff, for a fascinating conversation today.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Nick.
So appreciated it. Yeah, Joanna, tell people where they can follow you and find a little bit more about you or engage with your material.
So I have a website, which is joannamoncrieff.com. I'm on X, and I have published a book called Chemically Imbalanced, The Making and Unmaking of the Serotonin Myth, which is available at all reputable booksellers.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Joanna. We really appreciate the conversation and sharing your expertise. Thanks so much for listening to Flourish FM. We hope you enjoyed the content. Please be sure to leave us a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to your podcast and on all major social media platforms.
And if you visit our website, flourishfmpodcast.com, you can sign up to our newsletter. We send out a weekly newsletter. First newsletter of every month, we share a long form blog, and every newsletter, every week, we share highlights from our previous episodes. Please hit subscribe on our website.